yesterday's dusting of snow, which they would call a blizzard in Birmingham, but we would call sort of a hint of snow here. I'm so happy to see so many league members as well as so many members of the community here because so many of us care deeply about the river and our river valley. I'd like to begin by asking that if you have a cell phone, please turn it off or silence it so that it doesn't interrupt the flow. And each of our panelists is going to make a short presentation. When they have all finished, we'll have what I hope will be a lively Q&A portion of the event. You may have been offered an index card on your way in. If you have a question for one or any of the speakers, probably if there are other panelists who have an opinion on what the question is, they will speak up, and I will encourage that kind of sharing of opinions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Jonky will take the card. Rebecca here will screen them so we don't have the same question 4 times, and I don't have to shuffle the cards and probably drop them on the floor and embarrass myself. So thank you for the support of the team. The League of Women Voters of Amherst has had a position on the Connecticut River watershed for about 65 years, and we decided in the last 2 years that we really needed to update that, not just with the relicensing of some of the facilities along the Connecticut in Hampshire, in Franklin County, but also because terms like climate change didn't exist when our position was first penned by people who are wiser than me. So we've been working on that. This panel discussion is part of our educational program, and then we'll have a couple of other league member-only things to vote on the nitty-gritty of the new position before we make it official. So thank you for being here. I would like to begin with a short story that speaks to the different perspectives that we all bring to a situation. The story of the blind men and the elephant is found in ancient Jain, Hindu, and Buddhist sources dating all the way back to 500 BC. The parable is meant to illustrate human fallibility in light of divine mystery. The first blind man put out his hand and touched the side of the elephant. How smooth! An elephant is like a wall. The second blind man put out his hand and touched the trunk of the elephant. How round! An elephant is like a snake. The third blind man put out his hand and touched the tusk of the elephant. How sharp! An elephant is like a spear. The fourth blind man put his hand and touched the leg of the elephant. How tall! An elephant is like a tree. The fifth blind man reached out his hand and touched the ear of the elephant. How wide! An elephant is like a fan. The sixth blind man put out his hand and touched the tail of the elephant. How thin! An elephant is like a rope. An argument ensued, each blind man thinking his own perception of the elephant was the correct one. The Raja, awakened by the commotion, called out from the balcony. "The elephant is a big animal," he said. "Each man touched only one part. You must put all the parts together to find out what an elephant is like." Enlightened by the Raja's wisdom, the blind men reached agreement. Each one of us knows only a part. To find out the whole truth, we must put all the parts together. And then it seems fitting. We must acknowledge that we are standing on and benefiting from land that has been seized, expropriated, and taken from indigenous people, often through deceit, falsified deeds, and violence. For thousands of years, this has been Pecumtuck land. This is still the homeland of the Pecumtuck. They are still here. Their voices are still here in the air we breathe. These are still the homelands of the Pecumtuck, Norwatuk, Waranoko, Agawam, Nipmuc, and Abenaki. These native peoples and their descendants still living among us. They have not gone. Every time we gather here, we must acknowledge and respect that fact. But any land acknowledgement should also contain an acknowledgement of the land. We have been taught by Indigenous elders that to draw our minds together at the beginning of any gathering, we should remember to be grateful and thankful for all that we have been given. We give thanks to the sun every morning. We give thanks to the four directions. To all living creatures, they are our kinfolk and teachers. To the woodlands and rivers that sustain us, the Pocahontas, Green River, the Pocumtuck, Deerfield River, the Roanasiatak, Fall River, the Pagwag, Millers River, the mighty long Quonnecticut. We give thanks to the hills and plains who are a part of us as we are of them, to the last 7 generations and the next 7 generations, to our ancestors who have guided us and are here with us now. We don't have to ask for anything. All this has been given to us. Acknowledgement and expressing our thankfulness are the first steps in a long process of self-education. We must listen to Native voices who can remind us and teach us how to live in balance and reciprocity. We're all in this together. What will we do with what we have been given? I'm now going to tell you a little bit about each of our panelists. David Brule, Nolembeka Project President, is a member of Nahantlik Tribal Council. He is the coordinator of the National Park Service Battlefield Protection Program, whose goal is to identify the likely locations of King Philip's War, 1675 and 76, the Pesquiamskut Turner's Falls Battlefield and associated sites, including Native American community Pesquiamskut Wissatinawag. This is in partnership with an archaeologist, town historic commissions, and members of several New England tribes. Sarah Matthews is a practicing renewable energy attorney, Amherst resident, and co-founder of Western Mass Rights of Nature, a grassroots organization working to bring about the legal and cultural change necessary to recognize the inherent rights of the natural world to exist, thrive, evolve, and be restored. Since its formation, Western Mass Rights of Nature has been advocating for the Connecticut River and her ecosystem in the relicensing of the First Light facilities, working toward passage of local and state legislation that recognizes the inherent rights of the river and her ecosystem, and building community with individuals and groups who share these values and mission. Joseph Graveline is of mixed heritage descent. His mother brought with her her Cherokee and French Huguenot lineage, and his father brought with him his Vermont Abenaki and French lineage. He is not currently affiliated with any tribe. He was previously on the board of directors of the Friends of the Wissatinawag, co-founder and past president of the Nolembeka Project, was also a founder of the People's Harvest Indigenous Cultural Gathering on the Connecticut River that became the Pecumtuck Homelands Festival. He's a senior advisor for the Nolembeka Project, working on the relicensing of First Light utilities on the Connecticut River for the last 13 years. Also on the advisory board with David Brule for the battlefield research on the massacre of the Great Falls on May 19th of 1676. Eve Vogel grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but after college and Peace Corps moved to Oregon for 17 years. There she became fascinated with the relationship between rivers, hydropower, and regional electric power systems. After getting her PhD in geography in Oregon, she moved back to Massachusetts and has been researching and teaching at UMass ever since. She focuses on socio-environmental dynamics, histories, and policy related to rivers and electricity. Nina Gordon Kirsch is a river steward in Massachusetts for the Connecticut River Conservancy. Nina joined the Conservancy's staff after assisting with their water quality monitoring program during the summer of 2023. She moved to the Connecticut River Valley from Northern California, where she had spent the past decade working across the water industry, including regulatory and monitoring work for the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board. She also taught a high school field course on natural and human-made water systems and designing and installing professional gray water reuse projects. Before leaving California, she walked 240 miles along the Mullicomni River to trace where her drinking water came from and feels passionate about connecting humans to their water sources. Nina holds a master's in wastewater reuse from Ben Gurion University, completed a Fulbright scholarship in Israel and Palestine, researching the fate of endocrine disrupting compounds in the Palestinian water treatment, and earned her bachelor's in environmental science with a minor in marketing from USC. In her free time, you'll find her dipping in rivers all year round and hiking with her dog, Petey. So, we're going to begin with David, please.
Make sure you can hear me well. Everything is good. My voice and the mic don't get along sometimes. So, yes, I'm David, and I am really, it's kind of a homecoming for me because I taught in this building for about 30 years, even before it looked like this. So it's kind of a sentimental journey, too, to be here. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters for organizing the panel and for inviting me to say a few words. What I'm going to do is continue the elephant allegory, but with a different number of, let's say, beings. One of my favorite non-human beings is an animal that the Abenaki call awasus. So awasus is the Abenaki word for bear. And it's the genius of the Abenaki language is to combine syllables to create new words. So the awa part refers to beyond, far away. And the sus part is to take a walk. So if you know anything about bears, they are, let's say they have a great range and they travel very far. They'll come into your backyard and smash your bird feeders, and then within a few days they're somewhere. For example, I live in Miller's Falls. They tracked bears who wound up in Leverett and then Shutesbury and then over to Amherst and back through Deerfield, and they wound up in my backyard again. So that is a very important animal. Because awasus often stands on his hind legs, it has often been associated with human beings because we are upright. And the bear, especially, of course, the woman bear takes care of children a long time. So there's a lot of reasons why this particular animal among Native people, but also among all of us, is associated with the human spirit in a way, a bear. So I'm going to continue the elephant image, but I'm going to talk about our river and the bear. I was fortunate to have been born on the banks of the Connecticut River. I like to tell people in the middle of the last century, right after World War II, when my father came back home to what was then, or it's still called, Turner's Falls, and started a family. And I had the good fortune that my parents bought a home about a mile from where I was born, and I lived out my youth just overlooking the Connecticut River in a place called the Narrows on the river. And little did I know that particular spot, since we were not told our history, was the place of an untold atrocity. And so the way life works, I wound up being one of the people, along with Bud Driver and along with Joe Gravlin and a number of people, David Detmold up in the back, who spent decades studying what happened. So because of this long association with the river, I found this wonderful story that I want to share with you. And it's part of what we opened with in terms of the elders teaching us to bring our minds together, to think about specific things in a specific way, to be grateful. So this is the story about the bear people and the salmon people. Before there were any people walking around this valley, there were bear people. They had an agreement with the salmon. The salmon would come upriver every spring, and the bears would acknowledge this and take what they needed. This is the way it was with everything. Everyone lived by certain agreements and courtesies. But the bear people and the salmon people had no agreement with the river. It had been overlooked. No one thought it was even necessary. Well, it was. It was necessary. One spring, the river pulled back into the shore trees and wouldn't let the salmon into the river, come in from the ocean. Whenever they would try, the river would pull back and leave the salmon stranded on the beach. There was a long argument and a lot of talk. Finally, this river let the salmon enter. But when the salmon got up into the country where the bears lived, the river began to run in two directions at once. North on one side, south on the other. It was roaring, heaving, white water, big boulders were pushed around, trees were knocked down. Then the river was suddenly still. The salmon were afraid to move, and the bears looked out from behind the trees. The river said, in all of this silence, there had to be an agreement. No one could do just whatever they wanted. You couldn't just take someone for granted. So for several days, they all spoke about it. The salmon said who they were and where they came from. The bears spoke about what they did and what powers they had been given. And the river spoke about its agreement with the rain and the wind, the melting snow, crayfish, and so on. Everybody said what they needed and what they could give away. Then a very odd thing happened. The salmon said it loved the river. The bears said they loved the river too. No one had ever said anything like that before. No one had taken this chance. It was an honesty that pleased everyone. It made for a very deep agreement among them. They were able to reach an understanding about their obligations to each other, and everyone went on their way. This remains unchanged to this day. When you stand in the Pocumbagan, or the Pacumpatuk, or the Pagwag, the Wanastak, the Swift River, the West River, the Fort River. When you feel the river pulling and shuddering against your leg, that you are feeling the force of all these agreements. But when you stand in the Connecticut, in the Quinnuctakut, do you feel anything? Do you feel any pulling? Is there any sign of those agreements? There's anger in the water, stopped by a dam. Farther north, from the dam we're talking about, there's anger in that water too. The river is running in two directions, pulled far north, unnaturally, being pulled backwards. And then it flows the normal way, heading south again. We are here, we are the ones that need to forge a new agreement with our long river. This is what the day will be about. This is what our job is about. So thank you for listening, and that's my contribution. Aho.
Next, we'll hear from Sarah Matthews.
Thanks so much, David, and for the introduction, Sue, and for organizing this panel. So I'm sort of primarily reading because, excuse me, rights of nature and legal things generally are a little complicated, and I want to give you folks some concrete examples. So as Sue said, I'm a co-founder of Western Mass Rights of Nature. For those of you not familiar with rights of nature, it's a growing global movement responding to a recognition, as David has alluded to, that we are increasingly living out of balance and unsustainably with the non-human world. We can't go on like this and must reform our legal systems if we hope to address intractable problems like climate change and biodiversity loss. Western-based legal systems are anthropocentric. They only recognize the value of the non-human world as it relates to people. Only people, and unfortunately corporations, have standing to sue in court. As an example, I'm sure you're familiar with the Endangered Species Act, purportedly enacted to protect endangered animals and plants. But endangered species themselves can't sue to enforce the provisions of the act. Only people can sue for protection of an animal recognized as endangered, and the grounds for seeking protection has to relate to a demonstrated injury suffered by the person bringing the suit. The endangered animal itself doesn't have standing, and the injury suffered by the animal is not alone sufficient grounds for suing. This lack of standing is very problematic for folks who are trying to protect the natural world. I've seen this firsthand as an environmental attorney over the last few decades. It's why I became interested in the rights of nature movement and why I co-founded our group. It results in situations like the first light relicensing, as David's alluded to, the process in which the Connecticut River herself and her ecosystem, the ones that are most directly and severely impacted by the ecological damage done by the facilities, have no standing. They have no voice in the relicensing process. The rights of nature movement has made significant progress in recent years, frequently led by indigenous tribes around the world whose laws and cultural traditions are very different from those of Western-based governments. These traditions recognize the interdependency of the human and non-human world and the critical role humans must play in stewarding and caring for the natural world. For example, in New Zealand in 2017, following a decades-long struggle by Maori communities, the Wanganui River, or Te Awa Tupua, became the first river in the world to be recognized as a legal person under the Te Awa Tupua Act. The act is very moving to read. I encourage you all to read it. It's a form of reparations. It starts with an apology from the Crown, and it goes on to declare the river an indivisible and living whole from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements. An example in this country involves the Klamath River, which runs from Oregon through California to the Pacific Ocean, and in 2019 became the first U.S. river to have its legal personhood recognized by the Yurok tribe. For decades, Klamath tribes, including the Yurok, fought for protection of salmon in the river, as David was alluding to, who are critical to the tribes and whose numbers were increasingly depleted, largely due to ecologically destructive dam operations. In 2002, low water levels led to the death of over 65,000 adult salmon, the largest adult fish kill in U.S. history. In 2019, the Yurok tribe passed a tribal resolution recognizing the inherent rights of the Klamath River to exist, flourish, and evolve. This helped accelerate the decommissioning and ultimate removal of 4 dams on the river. It also provides an example of the strategic use of a different legal framework to address problems like the decimation of fish population caused by dams. The critical aspect of this legal framework involves codifying indigenous knowledge by recognizing non-human entities not as resources, but as rights holders. Following removal of the last of the 4 dams in 2024, a group of young tribal members kayaked the length of the portion of the river that's now dam-free, and when they reached the Pacific Ocean, that year's salmon fry were already there to meet them. I urge folks to watch the Oregon Public Broadcasting documentary of the young people's kayaking trip, complete with their GoPro footage. It's really great, very moving. Closer to home, on Cape Cod in 2023, a group of teenage members of the Mashpee Wampanoag were concerned about dramatic decreases in river herring returning to their freshwater spawning grounds, blocked by dams and inadequate fish ladders. They drafted and facilitated passage of a tribal council resolution declaring a state of emergency for river herring. The emergency declaration recognizes the rights of herring to migrate freely, procreate abundantly, and safely make their journey back to sea. It also recognizes that all fish runs in the Northeast Woodlands are under tribal jurisdiction and stewardship. I think the tribal youth are currently working to codify this resolution, which would then likely become the first rights of nature law enacted in Massachusetts. Once passed, this law could provide grounds for river herring rights of passage to sue for protection of river herring rights of passage along rivers and estuaries throughout the state. In closing, I want to add that our group, Western Mass Rights of Nature, and the Rights of Nature movement generally is not solely focused on legislative change, nor should its success as a movement be judged on the number of rights of nature laws passed and upheld. Equally, if not more important to changing laws, is changing cultural attitudes. Since our founding, members of our group have been building community with lots of different folks in our area who feel a deep connection to the Connecticut River and want to work together for her protection. I think of our community building as like knitting together the patches of a quilt. Though the obstacles we face, like the Turner's Dam and Northfield facility, seem immense, we look forward to a time when the river runs free. We remember that enough of us working together like the power of water are unstoppable. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Nina Gordon-Kirsch.
Hey everybody, I'm Nina, and I'm used to standing up while I'm talking, so this will be interesting to be stationary. We'll see how my body does. So I'm guessing all of you are here today already knowing a lot about the Connecticut River. I'm going to speak to a more basic level just to make sure we're getting everyone caught up in the room, because I do recognize some people, but I also don't recognize some people. So this is our whole watershed from the North Country down to the Long Island Sound. Huge watershed, and we are actually not even halfway up. There's so much more north of us that we don't often see or visit. And I would recommend, if anyone is wanting to take a fun summer trip, to go to the headwaters of the Connecticut River up by the border. It's really humbling to see our huge, huge river as a tiny, tiny baby. Like looking at little baby photos of this huge river that we drive across and that we are walking near, to see it as literally like this wide when it's born. So I'm quickly just at Connecticut River Conservancy, the nonprofit that I work for. We span all 4 states that the Connecticut River moves through. We have river stewards like myself who do advocacy and legislation and community outreach. We have our aquatic species team, which is aquatic invasive species removal, so taking out water chestnut and hydrilla in the summer. And we also have our fish monitoring, looking at fish migration and who are the different aquatic species living in the river and how do we best take care of them. We also have our water quality monitoring program, where in all of our states we do water quality monitoring in the summer months. And here in Massachusetts, it's a very a well-formed program. Every Thursday we take water samples, and every Friday we post those samples online so that people over the weekend can choose if they want to swim, boat, or fish based on water quality levels. And then we also have a restoration team that works on taking out dams on tributaries of the Connecticut. and planting trees. So today we're going to talk more about hydropower, or I will speak more about hydropower relicensing, which has already been referred to a little bit today. Every single dam in the United States that creates hydropower at a particular capacity has to get a license from the federal government in order to produce energy. And every 30 to 50 years, that license expires and has to get the hydropower facility has to get a new license. And we are in that place right now for two of our dams, or two of our hydro projects here in Massachusetts, Turner's Falls Dam and Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility. And then there's also 3 facilities on the Vermont-New Hampshire section of the river. So all 5 facilities are getting relicensed at the same time right now, and it started 13 years ago, and we're nearing the end. We're like in the last 2 years. Oh no, my pictures.
Are they down below there?
Yeah, that's weird. They're down below, but they're not.
What's your yellow bar say?
It says I'm not connected to the internet.
Do you want to connect?
Is it possible to connect? Let's see.
Yeah, our tech person went away.
That's okay. Oh,
Oh, he's going to come help you connect.
okay. I'll keep talking in the meantime. Oh, what an offer. I'll keep talking, yeah, while you do that. Thank you so much. So we have the 2 facilities are Turner's Falls Dam and Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility. And Turner's Falls Dam is a dam, and it pulls water out of the river and puts water into a power canal and holds the water in a power canal until it wants to produce energy, and then pushes it through smaller hydropower turbines out of the canal back into the river. And you'll see a picture of this when I show my screen again. But what that pretty much means is in the part of the river that is parallel to the power canal, there's no water. The water gets taken out of the river and then put back in the river further downstream. So there's sections of the river that are dewatered. You can see the rock bottom of the water. And in the previous license that's been operating for the last 50 years, that was okay. And in the new license, we are pushing for that not to be okay. And particularly so far, we've gotten we've gotten the new license to have a lot of water during fish migration season, so fish can go upstream in the dewatered section of the river. And we actually want there to be more water in that section of the river all the time, and in the summer months, July through November. Yay for tech help.
Yay for Milan.
So this is the Turner's Falls Dam on the lower left side of the photo. And you can see on the far right is the Connecticut River, and you can see rocks. You can see the bedrock, which is the bottom of the river. It's not supposed to be exposed in a natural way for the river to be. And on the left of the river, you can see a power canal that has a bunch of bridges on top of it, and that's full of water because the water gets taken out of the river up at the dam, and then it gets funneled back into the river once halfway through, and then again at the very bottom of this dewatered section you can see. And then Northfield Mountain is the other project that has a huge, huge, huge impact on the river and is like creates exponentially more power and more destruction to the river. And how it works is this is a reservoir that's up on a mountain. The river is below. And when we need power, the power company called First Light pushes water from this reservoir up on a hill, or they don't have to push it because gravity will just let it fall through turbines to create energy for us to use. And when it's not operating, when we're not needing more energy on the grid, they'll take water from the river down below and pump it up into the reservoir. And there is a net loss in energy for this type of design. It takes more energy to move the water uphill than it does for it to drop down, than it creates for the water to drop down. And they get a lot of profit from it, which Eve will speak more about after me. And this has huge impacts on the river because this is what's happening to the water level in the river. They're pulling water up to the top, then they're bringing it down, then they're pulling it up. And so the banks, the water level goes like this multiple times per day, and it causes erosion. The banks can't be stable. There's no plants that can actually grab hold because they either don't have water or they're inundated by water, or they don't have water. So there's no plant that, usually a plant is like, okay, I'm living here because I know the water is there and it's stabilized. And then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the group, the federal government that does the hydropower relicensing. We've been in this fight now for 13 years, and we're at the very end. Just last week, FERC issued the final environmental impact statement, which is the very last step in the relicensing process. And historically, it would usually, in other cases, take about 2 years from the final EIS to the final licenses given to the facilities. But we are actually suing the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for one aspect of the license, which is the 401 water quality certificate, which is like a big way of saying one part of the federal license is a state level certificate that our Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection is in charge of upholding our own state standards, regardless of what the federal government says. So we get to have this one part of the license that is solely based on our own Massachusetts laws. And we believe that our Mass DEP is not upholding the Clean Water Act as it is said to be upheld in Massachusetts. So Connecticut River Conservancy, along with other partner organizations in Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, are all suing we've filed for appeal, which is the first step towards moving towards a court process with each of the Department of Environmental Protection in all 3 states. So because of this, because we filed an appeal, it means that the new licenses are actually delayed to be given to the new hydropower facilities, which is a pro and a con. The con is that they're continuing to operate on their old license, which is a horrible license, and the new license already has a lot of benefits in it. But the pro is that we're fighting for an even better license once it does get into place, and that's going to last for at least 50 years because the next relicensing process will also take a number of years. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I will just plug that we have an advocacy fund right now that we're raising money for the appeals in all 3 states. And it is extremely expensive to hire lawyers to do this type of work. So any way that we can, if you know of people who would want to help support our appeal process, we're in like deep, deep need of financial support for our legal fees. And I'll hand it off to Eve.
Thanks, Nina. I need to read you my
Yeah.
Nina, when I come on, could you put your computer back on and bring up the Wissahickon property, the first? Yeah.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Eve Vogel. I'm a professor at UMass Amherst, and I've been working on sort of the interface of rivers and hydropower for, I don't know how long now, 30 years? Yeah, something like 30 years. First on the Columbia River and now on the Connecticut River. I also have done some work up in Hydro-Quebec with the hydropower that we're now bringing south as of about 2 weeks ago into New England. And my value added in this panel is really to make the connection between these hydropower projects and the electric grid and sort of how they interact and how I see we should be playing the trade-offs because everything about environment and energy is about trade-offs. There's no simple answers where everybody and everything wins all at once. So this is yet another map of the Connecticut River, one that some of you might have seen. And this is actually not just a map of the river, it's a map of the dams on the river, specifically the main stem and near main stem dams on the river. And yes, there are over 3,000 dams in the watershed. So we are talking about a watershed that has huge passage problems for any kind of aquatic organism throughout the system. Most of those are small. These are mostly the bigger ones. And I'm focusing on some of the dams that Nina was talking about, which that was a very helpful background, thank you. I was hoping that was going to come before I talked. And I just want to show you on this map where these 3 dams are. So can everyone see those 3 red circles? The southernmost one is Holyoke. The middle one here in northern Massachusetts is Turner's Falls. And then I also circled Vernon. That's going to be a part of my story. If you are looking at this map carefully and you see 4 and 3, just FYI, 4 is on the Westfield River, which is why it's not on my list. And 3 is actually the removed dam at Windsor Falls. But there is another project that didn't make this map because it's not a dam. It's a hydropower project. It's not a dam. That's the one Nina was talking about. That's Northfield Mountain. And as she explained, it pumps from and releases to the river between Turner's Falls and Vernon. I'll show you later sort of a map of that also. To understand the Connecticut River's role in the New England grid, you need to understand it on a whole different map. And I'm going to put the 2 maps side by side right now. Are you ready?
Oh my God.
All right, so this is the New England grid on the right, river on the left. And the same 3 projects show up in both maps, right? And they're both really important in both maps. So if I zoomed into the map on the right, one of the things you would see is that there are very high voltage transmission lines to and from Northfield in particular, because as Nina said, that is a massive project in terms of its capacity. It can generate up to over 1,000 megawatts. That's a rate, so that's an instantaneous rate. And like a large nuclear power plant is about 2,000. Small one is less than 1,000. So this is a project that at an instantaneous rate can produce as much power for the grid as a nuclear power project. The other ones are, just so you know, on the scale of 60. So that's the difference in the scale of how much they can produce at one time. And this just shows you I'm a geographer, right? So I like maps. This is the legend to the map. A couple little interesting things is pump storage shows up with its own little symbol. There are only 2 pump storage. Actually, there are 3 pump storage plants in all of New England, but they show up with their own special symbol because they do things that nothing else can do. And then the grid lines, so it's, again, one of these large blue grid lines that goes right by Northfield. So Connecticut River Hydropower is part of an integrated region-wide grid. So this whole grid is managed by a single institution. And it's managed first and foremost to keep our electricity on. So the lights on right now are running because this grid manager is doing its job. This is 7 a.m. this morning on the homepage of our grid manager. And I think this is lots of fun to look at. So here's that map again, right? It's showing you orange. That means that we weren't totally short of supply, but we were kind of getting there. When we have lots of supply, it's more in the green-blue range, and when we're really in trouble, it's more in the red range. So at 7 a.m. this morning, it was kind of in the middle. And when it gets in the middle, prices go up. So this is $228 per, I think it's per megawatt hour, but I would not swear to that. But when it's green, it's more like 30. So any generator that was generating at 7 a.m. this morning was making, I don't know, 8 times more than it might on a regular hour on a regular day in the grid. So that's just one thing to sort of look at. Then the second thing I want you to look at is here is the resource mix. So at 7 a.m. in the morning, 32% of our electric generation was by natural gas. On a regular day, that's going to be more like 60%. It gets really high most of the time. Most of our grid is powered by natural gas. 21%, this gray bar, is generated by oil. Okay, oil is our dirtiest, most carbon-emitting source of fuel that we use on the grid. Why are we using oil right now? Because we don't have infinite amounts of natural gas that comes into the region. And on a day like this morning, when the temperature is -2 Fahrenheit, the priority for the natural gas coming into the region is to heat people's homes. That leaves less for electric generation, and the only way we keep the light on is by burning our dirtiest fuel emitters at 20%, and during this cold spell we've had in the last few weeks, that's gone up above 50% some days. Nuclear is in orange. It's about 20% of our grid all the time. And nuclear it can't really go up and down like other kinds of generations. It's pretty much the same amount all the time. Net imports is 13%, and that is almost all hydropower from Quebec. And then renewables is about 11%. We'll talk about that later. 3% hydro. You add 3% to 13%, you get 16%. We think of our grid as not having a lot of hydro, but if you add that net imports to the hydro in the system, it's not that low. And sometimes it's up at 25% of our grid is hydro. We'll talk about when that happens and why. There wasn't a lot of renewables, and you're not seeing any solar on the system because the sun had just come up. And then finally on the right, you see a map of the system demand, or a graph of the system demand. Blue is what's predicted, and you can see it was planned to go up in the afternoon, way up in the evening. And then the yellow is what was actually showing up during the day so far. I'll talk more about this in just a minute. I'm going to go into more details, actually not about today as much as about yesterday and the day before. And I did it those 2 days because you can see one weekday and one weekend and kind of compare them. All right, so what was going on this morning? You had severe cold. Demand was high. Not a lot of natural gas, so you had, and no solar yet, so you were using a lot of oil, and we're using some hydropower. All right, here's Friday to Saturday, and I put in, just so you can see, noon, midnight. This is sort of a typical weekday when two things are going on. People are going to work, and in the middle of the day, they close up their house, they're not using a ton of appliances, demand goes down a little bit. But the other thing that happens in the middle of the day, a lot of the time, is the sun comes out. And when the sun comes out, all of us who have solar panels on our roof, the grid doesn't see that as generation, it sees it as lower demand. So what's going on with this dip here in the middle of the afternoon on a Friday is a sunny afternoon when people are at work. Now, you remember what happened around noon yesterday? It got cold and windy. Yeah, well, what happened to our electric demand in the second half of the day yesterday? It went way up, right? And we didn't have as much of a dip in the afternoon. All right, so there's you're seeing the weekend and you're seeing the weather change. So what happens to the resource mix? Well, it changes all the time to meet our demand. So up at the top, that's natural gas. And that's sort of matching this, but look what's happening over here. It's not matching this. So what happened here is natural gas needed to go to heating, right? And so what replaces it is this thing, that's oil. The orange is the nuclear. It's steady all the way across. And then the other thing I'm going to show you is at the bottom, this blue, this is hydropower. And so one of the things that's interesting about hydropower is you can see it's going up and up and up. Not exactly the same time as the demand peaks, but pretty close, right? So what happens is the grid is constantly changing when it's generating. And the things that are most variable to meet demand are going to be gas, hydropower, and oil. Most of the year we don't use any oil at all. It's only in these really cold spells some years the generation is never oil. This year we've got a lot of oil because of this 3-week-long cold spell we're in the middle of. But those are the three kinds of generation types that really can meet that flexible need for demand changes. We don't want it to be oil. Ultimately, we honestly don't want it to be gas either, right? Because we want to decarbonize. So hydropower is one of those things that's available to the grid that can meet flexibility. Other choices we'll talk about just a little bit at the end are batteries and demand response. Those are real options. But right now, hydropower is sort of the third thing on the grid that can do this, and it's a crucial thing that hydropower is used for. So here it is, just a little bit of a closer up, zoomed in version of the same thing. And now I'm going to bring in another graph for you. So the ISO does not say, all right, you turn on, you turn on, you turn on. There are like 1,000 generators in the whole region. That would be way too complicated. Instead, they've created markets. And so generators decide based on price, when to turn on and when to turn off. So here's a price graph of those same 2 days. And you can see price varies a lot. I really can't tell you exactly what all these peaks and valleys are. I can only say, like, you can sort of see the general shape matching demand. But who knows? It might be that at some point this is when, like, one of the oil generators turned on and that actually lowered relative price. I don't know. I don't know the details of the exact price here, but you get the sense that it's varying quite a bit, and it's roughly matching demand. All right. So here we've got the 3 graphs together. We've got the demand for 2 days, we've got the price for 2 days, and we've got the generation for 2 days. And now I want you to look again at the hydropower, and you can see hydropower is going up when price is going up. And it's not always when price goes up, but in general, you're going to get these flexible generators turning on when price goes up. That's the signal that they're following. So how does hydropower do this? In other words, what does that actually do to a river? Well, here's the oversimplified version. Here's when price is low. You keep the water in the reservoir, and you have almost no water in the river. And then when prices go up, you let water through, you generate electricity, and the river flows. Right? So, and then the company makes money. Here's what that looked like on Friday and Saturday, just below the Turner's Falls Dam. So the river's going up and down 2 feet, and if you've got vertical feet, you've got a lot more horizontal feet, right? So that's going back and forth in the banks a couple times a day. And I just put it there so you can kind of see how it fits. This is called hydropeaking. So it means you're peaking your hydropower plant according to electric price or demand. So then with Northfield Mountain, here's a map. Turner's Falls Dam is here. Vernon is just up here. Here's the upper reservoir. And just to review what Nina said, what this is doing is it's using excess power from the grid when supply is high and demand is low. It's pumping water up the hill. Notice the size of the upside down electric bolt. When it then generates, it's got a smaller electric bolt because it's not generating as much as it's using. And it's doing this now when prices are high. And it's always going to be looking for that price differential. It's not going to operate at all unless the prices vary during the day. So this is what Northfield was doing on Friday and Saturday, and this is pretty different from what you saw at Turner's, right? And so what seems to be happening is this is water level. So the river is gradually going down. So what's happening is it's pumping almost all of Friday, and then it starts generating. And so my guess is, and I'm guessing, because there's no public information about exactly what Northfield is actually doing, much less why it's doing. This is all being inferred from river gauges that are 9 miles away, okay? So, but I'm guessing what was going on was it was planning for that cold snap that hit around noon yesterday, and it was pumping to get as much water into that upper reservoir so it could generate through the cold snap that we were expecting. All right, and I just put the Northfield graph at the bottom here. All right, lessons. Hydropower is useful for the grid, especially if it can hydropeak. Hydropower harms rivers, especially if it can hydropeak. Hydropower operators generate and make money when it is best for the grid. When grid needs additional flexible power the most, hydropeaking and profits can dramatically increase. I'm just going to give you one example of that dramatically. This was when we had a scarcity event Christmas Eve of 22. Reserve prices went up almost to $3,000. Right? You remember that high price this morning was like 230? This was a day of 3,000. So I calculated that Northfield Mountain may have made over $10 million in a few hours that day.
13.
All right, so these projects can make a lot of money when they are following those grid prices and meeting grid needs. So here comes my opinion and what I have written in my comments. How do we balance the trade-offs? First of all, at Turner's Falls dams, we need more water in the river, less in the canal, because we need a river. We should limit hydropeaking. And it makes a huge difference because this is, I don't know if you can see this at all, but this is the little blue. Here's the dam. This is the power canal. This is where the water comes out of the power canal into the river. So it's this whole 2-mile stretch that gets totally dewatered. So by reducing hydropeaking and putting more river in the water, you're improving this habitat, and the habitat all the way down to Holyoke Dam. So huge difference if you limit the hydropeaking. Yeah, so this is what I just said. But you can allow greater hydropeaking when the grid needs it most. Most aquatic organisms are able to, handle fluctuations now and then. And this is actually what the new license is going to do. It's going to restrict them to real hydropeaking just to a few hours a month. And it'll be less allowed during migration season. So the hydropeaking provisions for Turner's Falls Dam, pretty much everybody feels good about. There are emergency exceptions, and I think I said this in the slide that's coming, but we're under an emergency exception right now, these 3 weeks. Northfield, at least, has been able to use its upper reservoir more than usual. And if you do this kind of balancing, you can meet the grid's highest needs, you can meet the company's greatest profit opportunities. Companies figured out that this kind of system gives them 99% of their profit that they're getting now under the current system. Northfield is trickier. You can't stop hydropeaking, or that means it's not operating. Like, it inherently has to make the river fluctuate in order to operate. So you mitigate and you monitor impacts. One of the things I, as an academic, have been pushing for is more monitoring, in part because we don't know. We don't have the public information about when this thing is operating, how much it's operating, what that's doing to the river. And then because of that, we can't correlate, what's going on the plant side to what might be happening in the environment side. They have reasons, for proprietary reasons, to not want to have that information public, but we could have a rule that maybe it only gets to be public a year later or something like that. Anyway, so that's one of the things that I have been pushing for, is just better monitoring. There's a variety of mitigation things that you guys have all been working on, which is great, which I'm not going to go into detail on. We should limit hydropeaking. That means not letting it go up and down too much, but maybe only this much. Ramping rates, so it's not super fast, but a little bit more even, where organisms can adjust. We need to have more restrictive limits in seasons that are important to aquatic and riparian life and recreation. And you can make exceptions in Northfield also when the grid needs it most, again, which we have right now. And currently Northfield is on an emergency order, and it allows greater use of that upper storage. So this kind of mitigation trade-off system could meet the grid's highest needs and the company's greatest profit opportunities. So in my opinion, yes, we need to license Northfield Mountain. It's incredibly useful and important for the grid, not all the time though, and it should not be operating all the time. And we should also be preparing for decommissioning it, because 30, 40, 50 years from now, we may have better batteries, we may have better pump storage, we may have a whole bunch of other kinds of resources for flexibility, and we could have a stranded asset on the grid 30 years from now if we're not putting money aside now. Secondly, Massachusetts does not need to incentivize operations for this plant. And it is on a binge to incentivize storage. We do need more storage on the system. This is already on the system. We don't need to pay it more. It's already earning plenty of money when it operates what it needs to do. So just slightly more, I'm probably way over time, so I'll just say, yes, storage is needed. And it's going to really decrease the amount we have to build of generation if we build storage. But we should not be paying extra, so through things like clean peak credits or storage procurements for this storage that already exists and already earns lots of money for when it does what it needs to do. All right, I think that's what I have, and I just thought you might be curious about what changed by 12:30 p.m. today.
Can you give Nina that?
Joe Gravelin is now going to speak to us.
Thank you all for coming. Grateful that we can all learn something today from each other. And David's piece makes me pretty emotional. I grew up on the Pocahontas River, the Green, with my best friend. Taught me how to swim. Taught me how to find beauty in the smallest little creatures that swam on the bottom of that beautiful, clean river when I was a kid. That was prior to Route 91 coming through. I missed the French play because I was busy trout fishing on the Green River. Kind of wish I didn't, because my lineage is French, and I would have liked to have pursued the language, but those beautiful brook trout were calling me. And so I've spent my entire life on the Pocahontas and the Connecticut River and the Deerfield River. I've never not lived my life out on a river. 40 years now, I've owned land in the Connecticut River floodplain, and I currently own land on the river. I've watched over the 40 years. I've lost 50 feet to the west because I'm on the east side of the river. I've lost 50 feet of land that has encroached back in toward the east on the east bank from its original bank. And then when they did the drawdown this summer, I walked out there, marked it off in 10-foot increments, and found the original edge of the land where it was over 40 years ago. Piping is the thing. You get out, when you go to the ocean and you walk out onto the sand and you stomp up and down and the water comes in and everything gets soupy, and then you walk away and the water washes back out. Well, that water doesn't just wash back out. It takes with it particulates. It undercuts, in the case of a river, it undercuts the toe, and the riverbank falls in. It disintegrates. I want to give you a Narragansett blessing. Tayu Bantanamuk Wachi Wimi. We're giving thanks for all things, those things which we ask for, and received those things which we did not ask for and received that happened to be just what we needed. This is what we have today. This picture up here, back in the 90s, the late 90s, the Friends of Wissahickon purchased that dusty little area where all the sand is there. That piece of property, 63 acres. Bought it from the Mackin family. Got a grant, got some funding from Camille Cosby. She was a powerful help in buying that property back in the 60s. Over 300 indigenous burials were dug up and pushed into White Ash Swamp, which is right across the French King Highway, from that property. And we felt it was about time to stop desecrating those indigenous graves. This happens to be the most significant indigenous and longest lived village on the whole of the Connecticut River. Connecticut River is 410 miles long. This area here falls at about mile 122 on the river, and I can be corrected on that, but I'm pretty close. My property falls at about river mile 126 from Long Island Sound coming up. The property was 63 acres, and we needed a little bit more help to buy the property, so we brought in Massachusetts Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We allocated to them 22 acres of the 63-acre property. We're the predominant landholders that have frontage on the Connecticut River. For some reason or another, we didn't realize back when we brought in Fish and Wildlife, it excuse the pun, they were going to sell us down the river, but they sold us down the river. We tried to get a communication with Mass DEP, thought, well, the Governor's Office of Environmental Justice and Equity Program ought to be able to hang in there for indigenous-minded people who happen to own land in this particular waterfront area. The water that runs down across the Wissatinnewaug property is a small stream that comes from the drainage of White Ash Swamp called Falls Brook. Falls Brook runs into the Connecticut River. The Connecticut falls into Fall River. Fall River runs into the Connecticut River. There is your link to have standing. It runs across our property. It runs across a piece of our property that we have been doing a hazardous waste cleanup on for a number of years now. We're very mindful of trying to keep Falls Brook clean because it runs into Fall River, which happens to be the cleanest body of water in western Massachusetts. It was so clean that the paper companies bought the rights to it in the 1800s. It was amazingly clean water. Nobody wanted to, from the federal government, they didn't want to acknowledge the fact that we had standing. Mass DEP, they completely ignored the Governor's Office of Environmental Justice Program and said, we don't have any intention of talking to the tribal coalition. We're going to be in communication with them to try to force that conversation to turn around because we are the keepers of the knowledge. We've been doing it for a long, long time. We have a tribal coalition that has deep, deep roots in the history of the Connecticut River Valley and of the water and of the bear and all the living creatures that are part of this living group of entities that we call the Connecticut River Valley. The Connecticut River is an amazing work of nature. It's a giant flowing magnet, and it's iron and steel that gravitates to it is called life. The life of this river is amazing. I want to talk about the mountain project real quick. It takes 30% more approximately energy to pump the water up onto that mountain than it can possibly produce going down that mountain. I want to talk about where that energy comes from to turn those amazing, huge turbines. It comes from gas and oil, the majority of it. It is not a clean entity. It loses 1/3 of its energy going back down, and it comes from carbon-based energy. The amazing thing, as you saw in Christmas Eve, back when they generated, and my numbers come out to be $13 million in a couple of hours. Easy to see why the Canadian government is really happy about owning that particular piece of property. But I want to talk about something that's really, really important. First of all, in 1968, as the communication with the public was happening about creating a pump hydro project on Northfield Mountain, the utilities that were brought together through Western Mass Electric Company, they were a combination of utilities, and I don't want to get into the details of that because I want to talk about the real mechanics here. It was cited in a paper written in 1970 by Charles H. Foster, Harvard University, Petersham, Mass., called the Harvest Forest paper. If anybody wants to get a copy of this, put your name on and your email address on a piece of paper and give it to me, and I'll make sure you all get a copy of this. So, in 1970, Western Mass Electric went straight to the public, went the Connecticut River Watershed Council, everybody, and they decided they wanted to have good relations. Not the kind of thing that the Nolan Beaker Project Tribal Coalition is going through right now. They wanted to have good relations. And so they went right toward the roar. They started discussing all the ups and downs and this and that of all the challenges of building, of taking a mountain away that was owned by the citizens of Massachusetts and building a for-profit energy generating facility on top of that mountain. But the one thing I want to let you know is they left out one important piece of information that the engineers knew about in 1968. And that is when they decided to do a taking of land from landowners all up and down the Connecticut River basin here where the floodplains are, they made it a point to tell them, our project is going to produce waters that will deliver onto your property ice, debris, material. We will erode your bankings, and we will reverse the flow of your river a number of times a day. That never made it into the Harvard papers. They never realized that that one really well-kept secret was kept completely out of the media. So they knew they knew that that was going to happen in 1968, and all those easement deeds still retain that language, that we have the right to reverse the flow of the river, to flood your property, and to damage anything that you happen to build out in those floodplains. So if you're going to build something in those floodplains, you do so at your own risk, and we have the right to destroy it. And that is still how it exists right now. Now, here's the big thing. First Light wants to add an additional 4 feet into the storage, even if it's temporary, into the storage capacity of the Northfield Mountain Project. Now, in the Harvard papers here, it was well understood that at that time, the design of the project was facilitating that extra storage of 4 feet for a very, very, very specific purpose. And that was to take advantage of the cleanest possible water that they could get during the spring freshets and put it in a big pipe and send it out to the Quabbin Reservoir for the town of Boston. And so they were going to do that a number of days a year, and that's what that extra 4 feet that was put into the engineering design of the mountain project was designed for. It wasn't designed to be utilized to hold the capacity right now. The capacity of the mountain project right now, prior to any 4-foot increase, is 4,013,800,000 gallons of water. If they add that additional 4 feet, they will be adding a significant amount of what they call water acreage. And that's going to come very close to doubling that capacity. Now, I want to read to you something that was written by John Spain, who is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regional engineer for our area. He'd been hammering on First Light relevant to the mountain project for over a decade, just pushing them to try to pay attention to what the hell they're doing. And I have a decade's worth of what they call comprehensive assessment reports. These are the safety inspection reports that are done for the dams that are up and down the rivers. In the case of John Spain in his area, he's supposed to take advantage of making sure that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission looks at these projects at least once a year and creates a safety inspection of these things. So what he's telling them on September 3rd, 2025, and these are public documents, so I don't, most of the stakeholders within this licensing process got every single document that I have here. The difference is I took the time to read them. And I took the acronyms and I flushed them down my toilet and I put in what the acronym really meant so that you can have a readable document, so you can have something that you can read and understand. And when you start reading these documents without the acronyms in there, you say to yourself, what the hell is going on? What's going on? So John Spain is telling them look, you got some serious problems. The currently available freeboard, meaning without the extra water in there, the likelihood of a non-breach spillway flows from either a flood event or an overpumping event, which is a human error event, by the way, is less than 1 to the 10th of 7th power. Estimated life loss is 5. That's without the extra freeboard, mind you. Estimated life loss is 5 due to the potential emergency spillway operations. Therefore, as noted above, if there is any change in the freeboard, the likelihood of spillway operation-related potential failure modes should be reevaluated. Well, what's happening is John Spain is not getting a straight answer from the FERC independent consultants. Now, the Northville Mountain Project is a Delaware limited liability corporation. And if any of you want to plug your phone in and pull up what a Delaware limited liability corporation is, go ahead and do that and tell me what it says, because I already know what it says, but most of the folks don't. But what it means is, if that project fails, and those 5 people, or 10 people, or 20 people, or 30 houses, or Route 63, or the railroad, or whatever happens when a mountain fails, because Bud Driver here is an engineer, he'll tell you, when an earthen dam fails, it fails quickly. And it's called catastrophic failure. And when it does, it takes everything with it. It'll take that mountainside down, it'll take every rock, every tree, every structure, and it'll just ram it toward the river because that's all it knows is gravity. 4 billion, 13,800,000 gallons without the extra 4 feet. I'm very concerned that they don't get that additional 4 feet storage. They have what's called a spillway. Now, Spain goes into detail about why the death rate would be so high. He talks about the fact that during a flood event, we're not talking a sunny day event here where all of a sudden something happens like it did in 2023 when the mountain started to fall apart and the rocks blocked the intake tunnel that's carved out of the mountain, and a valve failed on one of the turbines, and the control room flooded, which means we don't have any... Grid, hello, are you there? We don't have any control anymore. You guys are on your own. I'm sorry. We've all flooded. He's addressing that. He's saying, if you have an event that happens during a flood event, if you have a breach where you have to utilize the spillway, you're going to be dumping water down the spillway as fast as you can to keep that dike or earthen dike or dam from failing. And when you do, it's going to be running north against a flooded Connecticut River. And when it runs north against the flooded Connecticut River, all hell's going to break loose for all the people that have property down in the floodplains. From the Turners Falls Dam to the Vernon Dam. Now, the Vernon Dam had a flow meter added that was part of the licensing. They retired the flow meter because it was no good. People think, well, the mountain project moves the water north 2 or 3 miles. No, it moves it right to the Vernon Dam. And the reason it moves it to the reason we know is because they had to retire the flow gauge because it didn't make any sense anymore. All of a sudden, the amount of water that's coming out of the Vernon project doesn't seem to relate to the flow gauge. So they retired it. So all I'm saying is, things are worse than you think when that river reverses. And when it reverses, it does what you do when you go to the beach and you're a little kid and you pound on the sand and the water comes in and the water goes out. Up and down 2 or 3 times a day. The higher, the more water, more lateral pressure, atmospheric pressure. If you're a diver, you know what I'm talking about. It's called atmospheres. For every meter you go down, you increase it by 1 atmosphere, 29.9 pounds per square inch. Well, this plays itself out on the riverbanks on either side of the river. And in the case of my property, I have a basalt ledge on the other side of the river. So that doesn't care what happens. But my property is the most beautiful topsoil you'd ever see. It's called the Little Nile by the colonials when they moved here. The Connecticut River Valley was so fertile, they called it the Little Nile. And we as farmers, we're losing that. It becomes siltation. It becomes something that's in conflict with the Clean Water Act. And we're losing it because the river goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Now, they knew they had to license that project because they had a nuclear plant they wanted to bring online. And they needed to have somebody who could take the extra load from the nuclear plant because they can't ramp up and they can't ramp down fast enough. And that's why they came online. But I watched that river never freeze for the better part of 40 years. But when they retired the Vernon nuclear plant, for the first time in centuries, for the 40-year stretch at least, I saw that river freeze. And I was really concerned because I knew that when the ice froze in the winter and they did a hard drawdown of 4 feet, maybe 5 feet, you had 300, 400 feet from shore to shore of 18 inches of ice. How many tons is that, Bud? I don't know. A lot. When there's no buoyancy left underneath that ice to support it, it's going to fail. Animals, people, they see that river frozen, they think they can drive their skeeters out on it, walk out on it, chop a hole, go ice fishing. Not an impoundment. You're going to have some trouble there. There's a lot of safety concerns going on. I've just scratched the surface. I've got over a decade's worth of these dam safety inspection reports, and they are not good. They're not good at all. I'm going to encourage anybody that has the ability to write to FERC I'll send these things out if you folks, most of the folks should have had them who are stakeholders. I don't know if the Women League of Voters were getting the regular notices from FERC or not, but they're public documents, and you should have been getting them, but most people see the acronyms in there, and they try to read it, and they say, this is just, it's just not anything worth reading. It's probably the most worth reading stuff that you would ever see if you love your river. What we would like to talk about could go on for hours and hours, because David and I have been doing so much work with the history for so many decades. We can't do it, but I appreciate your time.
As a clarification, I would like to point out that First Light was invited to participate today, and they declined because of their ongoing appeals. They didn't feel that it was appropriate for them to speak to the public. So it's not that they were excluded. We invited people with different points of view, but do you want to just stand up and stretch, and then we'll start our questions?
Could I speak for 5 minutes with your board? To speak to the audience? I just need 5 minutes, I promise. I know it's irregularly, but...
Ask me a question, Bud.
Well, you know that the eastern border falls the Connecticut River,
That's right.
So you have Vernon Nuclear Dam on the river, and you also have the Northfield project on the river. So it's on a border fault. So at any time we could have an earthquake and everything turns to liquid. So I don't know if any of you guys know that.
See, Bud's addressing the fact that if you live on my side of the river, you're on the continent of Africa. I'm dead serious. And if you live on the west side of the river, you're in North America. He's talking about Pangea, the continental, the coming together of the continents. And it is a border fault. It's real, it's measurable, and it's significant.
I just want to speak to you guys for 5 minutes. I promise you'll be happy. I've known
If
David-
you don't speak into a microphone, then it won't be available to the people that are not present.
Now I'm on stage, right?
Well, you're taking the stage, and I'm not going to wrestle you to the
Thank
ground.
you very much for letting me do this. Joe and David Detmall and...
Right up close, Bud.
Oh, hello. Oh, my name is Bud Driver. I lived in Deerfield for 27 years on the Connecticut River, but I also lived in the Northampton Meadows my whole life on the Connecticut River. So the Connecticut River has been a place for me for recreation, but I'm an avid hunter and fisherman, so I spent my whole life fishing on the Connecticut River, and I'm also a geologist and an archaeologist, so I've spent a lot of time doing that along the Connecticut River drainage system. And so what's important to me is what you all are talking about, how important the Connecticut River is and the drainage systems that run into it. And one of the things that I researched was the Connecticut River in the 1600s was 14 feet lower than what it is today. And the reason why we know that is because Miller's Falls, where David lives, Miller's Falls, the Miller's River ran into the Connecticut, and there was a 14-foot waterfall. Right now, the Connecticut River marries the Miller's River like this. So that's why we know that the river in the 1600s was 14 feet lower. So that's really important to know, and that's all part of the dam building processes. And so that map that I brought for you guys to see, it's when in 1794, Massachusetts court system ordered all the towns to create a map of their meets and bounds of their towns. And so there was no dams built. So what I did was I went to the archives and I took out each map of each town from Holyoke to Northfield. And then I went to a copying store and I had them scaled so they would be the same size. And I created one 6-foot-long map of the Connecticut River between Holyoke and Northfield with no dams on it. So you can actually see the Connecticut River with no dams, which not too many people know that. So I did it for as a visual aid for geology and archaeology with all the other stuff I'm involved with. And so living on the Connecticut River my whole life, I've seen the changes on the river itself. From 1968 forward, the state getting involved with determining the water levels adjacent to the river itself. It would monitor up and down, and there was like these monitoring wells along the river that the state put in, and they would measure when they released the water at the Holyoke Dam, how the water table changed. So they were always, I wasn't involved at the time. I was more using the Northampton Meadows as a recreational area than I was about knowing about the science behind what there was going on. But they've been monitoring the water levels since the late 60s. So I know there's a lot of science behind all that, but I was never involved with any of that. But I was, in the sense of the Rowe nuclear power plant, I helped decommission that for the Chembro Corporation. And I worked at the Vernon nuclear power plant to dig the floor of the river up so that it would be a deeper hole there for the water. And I also was at the Northfield Mountain as a child with my grandfather. He would go in the tunnel to work on Saturdays, and I'd fish the brook out in front for brook trout. So it's funny how everything's come around, full circle for me in particular. But being on the river my whole life, the sea-run brown trout, the shad, the striped bass, the alewives, the smelt, all that stuff was a different time period, and I got to fish for all those fish in the river. And you don't hear of too many people catching trout out of the Connecticut River, but it's full of trout at a certain time of the year. But so things have changed, and one thing in particular, I was taking notes, and this one is for Sarah. So Sarah, in the Connecticut River now, there's a subspecies of a beaver. Because the tributaries are so saturated with beaver, they're living in the Connecticut River now, but they're confused because they can't dam the river. So I don't know what's going on with these beaver, but they actually hollow out the embankments and they create a beaver hut like you would see in a pond, but they're in the Connecticut River. It's really strange. So I brought that to a few people's attention, but I've never heard back, but that's what's happening. So the fur-bearing population has changed because they changed all the trapping laws. So when you have a stream like the Sawmill River or 4 Mile Brook or whatever's got trout in it.
Excuse me, I'm really sorry, but we have questions that people have submitted the way that we've requested.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you 15 seconds to
Okay.
finish up.
So that map there is a map of the Connecticut River with no dams on it. So I don't know if you want to show that, but you can photograph it if you'd like. Yeah, I only did it for visual aid, and it's not. So I'm normally in the forest. I'm not out in the public, and that's probably why I don't speak very well. But I know so much about things that is important to share with all of you, such as the river being 14 feet lower in the 1600s. So it changes the whole dynamics of the Connecticut River, such as Elwell's Island was never there. Hockenham Ferry Island was never there. Shepherd's Island was there. And the Indians from Bark Wigwam site, they were buried on those islands. So there's all this really important stuff pertaining to the Connecticut River that we don't know.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, this question
Thank you, Bud.
can go to whoever feels most capable. How effectively will the license's new rules on limiting river levels protect against erosion?
You want to take that?
So the proposed license, or the license that is to be given to First Light as of now, for erosion above Turner's Falls Dam, there's a band, in a river height band, that they have to operate between most of the time. And then there's certain conditions under which they're allowed to go outside of that band. So if they stay in that band, it's going to help make erosion not worse, I would say. And they are able to go outside of that band under particular conditions. So we're hoping that erosion won't get worse. At this point, we don't feel erosion will get better. We're asking for more monitoring. We're asking for more public data on what's going to be happening with the water, and more money from First Light to put towards all of that, and mitigation as well.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank
I'll
you.
stop there.
Thank you. Why is it a 50-year license? Shouldn't it be a shorter interval?
Yes.
Is there anything about this cycle of relicensing that will shorten the interval from 50 years to something reasonable?
I'd like to put it into perspective, because we had enough conversations with the CEOs of the Canadian First Light companies, the Delaware LLC. Certainty. That's a priority for them. I'm willing to put $10 on the table, and if anybody wants to put odds against it, I'm going to tell you this. Western Massachusetts citizenry are a tough bunch of nuts. We don't like being screwed with. We don't like our environment being tampered with, and we fight like hell. And when the Kinder Morgan pipeline people wanted to come through Western Massachusetts, FERC came down and said, "Well, we'll have a sit down and talk with you guys." And by the way, that was being broadcast live back to Washington D.C., right, Bud? So at the Greenfield Middle School, when we all came together and had our sign saying, "FERC, do your job, FERC, do your job," by the end of that 4 hours, and it was a long 4 hours because we hammered the crap out of those guys, they made it a point never, ever again to allow public input where the public comes together in the numbers that we did. The last time around at GCC, they took us out into a back room like a mafia group, and they allowed us to talk to them, but they never had a two-way conversation. But if you look at the final environmental impact statement, it says that they had conversations with the coalition, with the indigenous coalition, it was the Nolambika Project Tribal Coalition. They said it never happened. It didn't exist. We were always allowed to say something, but there was no real two-way communication here. Nobody said, "Well, hey, we got some ideas. What do you think?" No, never ever happened. So I want to tell you that. So the thing is, certainty is the reason why the 50-year license is being pursued. I don't want a 50-year license. I think the technology is going to change so drastically in the next 50 years that a 50-year license is just a throwaway. But what I'm telling you is the reason that the 50-year license was being sought after was for certainty. And what I see happening is as soon as they get this license and they can get a buyer, they're going to push this project off onto somebody somewhere else in the world. And we're going to have somebody somewhere in the world owning a piece of our loved real estate and telling us what we can and what we can't do. Particularly for me as a landowner, I'm not thrilled about that. I don't like the fact that I lose property to a corporation that doesn't pay me a dime, and that I know in the case of the Mountain Project, who is the biggest abuser of the impoundment area, that they're making some serious money, and everybody else is paying for it, whether it's out of your taxes for subsidies or what have you, or whether it's out of landowners, or whether, and you have a question?
I have an expanding question.
Yes.
So we've got this 50-year contract, and I've seen some of the first stuff. They're saying, oh, we have all these great concessions, but we're going to do that in 10 years. Right?
20 years,
Started-
30 years.
And so if they sell it, are all of those concessions, do they just evaporate?
In theory, no, it's supposed to follow the license, yes.
Thank you.
So I'm
Okay.
sorry to interrupt and not write down. My question is way too long. I'm a member of the Connecticut River Defenders. We call for the shutdown of Northfield Mountain. Now. What Joe described is a sacrifice zone. All of these projects have sacrifice zones. They know that they're going to destroy and kill people. And Eve, I don't understand how you justify the use of that project when this is what it is, or how you call ISO doing their job. They too are registered in Delaware. They call themselves a non-profit. This stuff has got to go. Where is the call in our state for what Joe and David have called for, which is reciprocity, understanding, sharing, knowing about our environment, and respecting it? We have no one in our government calling for reducing our use of our resources, of our electricity, any of that. Where is that? How can you dare ask us to sacrifice the river and our mountains when you can't even join and say, we have to cut back. We have to stop this. We can't survive without it. So what the use is all of this? What is the use of
Okay, thank you.
Shut it down.
I
We've
just
heard
want to
you.
say I just want to say I totally agree. I feel like what Eve presented to us shows us that we actually, there's two different sides of it. The company has to supply energy, so they're trying to figure out how to supply energy to the market because there's a demand for it. Why is there a demand for it? Because of us. Because of us. So if we, the humans who created the energy grid, decide to use less power, or for instance, if we choose to do our laundry during the day instead of on the weekend, or when people are if you're working from home or if you don't have a job, thinking more about how and when we're using our energy can change what the demand is on the grid.
Thank you. As more equipment, including AI and residential heating systems, are converting to electric, more pressure will be put on the grid. What plans are in place to accommodate this change, other than the personal responsibility that Nina just mentioned?
There are people working on this. So I'm thinking of Paul Fenn, who is the person responsible for community choice aggregation, first in this state and then on to California, where they issue green bonds. The aggregators can issue green bonds and have built a lot of renewable energy projects that produce the energy for local communities at a much lower price because that bond funding is available up front to build renewable energy projects. And our group is actually meeting with Paul soon and talking about, because he's interested in sort of a 3.0 of what he's doing, where there's more locally owned and produced. So getting off the grid, which doesn't work for us anymore in many ways. So more locally owned and controlled and produced power. So that's a little vague, but I do think there are folks, really super smart folks working on this, and I personally think that that is at least a answer to that question.
Thank you. Can Massachusetts take ownership of these facilities, and if so, how?
I mean, I can answer that. Yeah. They could. Actually, I think Eve knows a lot about how electricity through the use of hydropower is done out west that's different from how it's done now. So maybe actually you should answer that.
It's complicated, but yeah, there is this, right? There's eminent domain, so the states and federal government can take private property. That is always a possibility. They could force that. That is, they could also offer to buy it. We restructured our grid about 25 years ago, so around the turn of the century. And because of that, First Light and almost every power generator in New England is not owned by an electric utility anymore. A few still are, but in general, they're not. That makes it even more complicated than it used to be. But, so like Maine had a referendum a few years ago, right, to turn its electric utility into a state-owned utility. If you have a utility that is vertically integrated, that is, that it owns generation, it owns transmission, it owns distribution, then you could have a publicly owned utility that would own the generation, and it could own something like this. But we've made it much more complicated and unlikely for that to happen through the restructuring process. I don't know, Sarah, how deep could I go into this?
Well, what about the out west where the state is in?
So, I spent a lot of time working in the Pacific Northwest. And in the Pacific Northwest, the grid is owned by the federal government, by the Bonneville Power Administration, which is basically a sort of a little brother to the Tennessee Valley Authority. And because there's federal, and almost all their electric power comes from the Columbia River, from hydropower. So that's federal public hydropower. And traditionally, ever since the Reclamation Act of the early 1900s, federal power is sold preferentially to public and cooperative utilities. So because of that, the Pacific Northwest still has over 100 public and cooperative local utilities, some of them at the level of cities, some of them at the level of counties, and those deliver power at cost to customers. So it's a very different system. Here in Massachusetts, we have about 40 municipal utilities. I don't know how many own their own generation, maybe a quarter of them. Most of them are buying from some kind of supplier and selling to their local generator. But we're forbidden under current state law from creating any new ones. And basically there was this deal that happened around the 1910s that said, municipal utilities are threatening the profits of the private power companies. We don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to regulate the private power companies. And that's how we got regulated utilities. And we actually, when utilities are regulated, it actually works reasonably well. Not perfectly. I could talk for a while longer about that, but it is a reasonable system and it creates some accountability. But with restructuring, when we separated out generation from our utilities, we have no state regulation of what generators do in terms of what they're selling and to whom, and nothing, right? Like there's absolutely no relation anymore to how we as a state or as members of the state can affect a generator. It's like totally indirect. So the only way is through FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They have an ability to regulate power markets and therefore generators and how they interact with the markets. But the way they've regulated, and one of the things in regulation is that they have to be providing energy for a public interest. But that's basically been redefined over the last 20, 25 years since restructuring to mean that it's competitive. That's it. That's how FERC defines public interest in terms of electric, price and provision. And so we have because of restructuring, we have even less ability to sort of regulate what happens on the power market. So I will say one good thing that's been happening. I don't know, are any of you active in Fix the Grid? There's an amazing network of activists that have been working to reform the New England grid and sort of break open its governance, because ISO New England is a quasi public entity that's regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and there are ISOs in other parts of the country that are much more open to public input and open governance. And there's a group that's really been trying to reform ISO New England. And it is following in the footsteps of our governor and our attorney general and those of the other New England states who have been fighting really hard. So there's a possibility of, it's not directly affecting the generators, but, affecting the regional grid through governance reform of the grid. That's sort of where I see the most possibility. It's not exactly the same as public ownership, but at least it would provide greater public input and influence over how electric markets work.
Okay. Who decides when the grid is in emergency mode for extra use? Is there an objective or is it a subjective decision? Eve, I think.
Yeah. I don't know the details, but basically it's fairly objective. There are particular criteria. So there are particular criteria for different kinds of operating scarcity events. And when ISO New England thinks it's going to need some extra provisions on its generators, it puts together a document. You can see the one that it put together in January. It then applies to FERC. FERC has to approve it. The emergency order that was approved in January that has been now extended to February 14th or 15th not only allows Northfield to use its full upper reservoir capacity, but basically reduces the emissions restrictions for the fossil fuel generators all over the region.
Okay. This is a question about the Northfield project. Plant and animal damage because pullback goes through a grinder. Does the new license address this?
Yes, the new license requires a barrier net for the intake of the water that goes from the river up to the reservoir. And we have argued our way from, it was originally, I think, it would be implemented 7 or 9 years after the license, down to 5, and we're still shooting for 3. So that's a part of our appeal.
Thank you.
I do believe, though, that's not 365 days a year. Of course, the river freezes in the winter, but what is the span through the season on that?
Yeah, I don't remember the dates exactly, but it's for fish migration season, so it goes up before fish migration season starts, and it's taken down after fish migration season ends.
So it appears to be geared toward migratory fish as opposed to fish. And we know that we know that sturgeon eDNA had been identified in 5 locations above the Turners Falls Dam. Sturgeon are an endangered species, and so far, Massachusetts has refused to acknowledge that, and so far it appears that FERC has refused to acknowledge that as well. About 5 years ago, 2 young boys discovered young sturgeon fry, about 4 inches long, in a drainage tunnel under Route 10 in Northfield, Mass. They were given a pictorial of over 500 fish to pick out the fish that they saw that day. They called it a dinosaur fish. They said it was covered with bones on the outside of its body. And they ran through the 500 pictures and landed on the sturgeon. Now, Mass Fish and Wildlife said if you don't have any young sturgeon, then you don't have mating sturgeon. You don't have reproducing sturgeon in the upper reaches. So, you found some sturgeon eDNA, doesn't mean anything. Well, it does, because there are young sturgeon there. And I think they're trying to figure out how to deal with the changes in the water table, particularly during high storm events or spring freshet. And that's why they ended up in a overrun area that ran into Miller's Brook into a tunnel in Northfield. And those sturgeon were in there, and they were young, which means that they were there. Now, the Fish and Wildlife said, well, we know for a fact the sturgeon could have never made it over the Turner's Falls Dam. But they forgot about the fact that when the glacier receded, shortly after the glacier receded, you had a drainage system that was part of what they call the Miller's drainage system, the Green River and the Connecticut River drainage system, ran 80 feet on the glacial till that was left on the bottom deposits of the glacier when it left, 80 feet above its current level, which means there was no Turner's Falls fall. And also, the Connecticut River ran on both the west side and the east side of Rocky Mountain, which was in the picture that Nina had up there of the Wissahickon property. Now, these sturgeon have been around for millions and millions of years, and when they become landlocked, they don't have a problem with that. They set up their roots and they stay there. So they couldn't make it over the falls. Give me a break. The flood of 1936, there was a dam at Turner's Falls in the flood of 36. And in the flood of 36, the water that was coming over that dam was hitting the water that was below that dam just about a foot lower than this table right now. There was no falls in the flood of 36. So even up to the flood of 36, I got to tell you something, sturgeon are powerful swimmers. There was a woman that had her face lacerated open last spring on the, what river was it? She was out in a boat in the mouth of one of the rivers coming down out of the northeast here. I think it was the Merrimack River. She was in the boat, and up through the air came this giant fish, landed in front of her in the boat, but as it came across, its shoots cut her face open, and she had like 25 stitches. This was a sturgeon that was able to leap clear out of the water into a boat 4 or 5 feet above the boat, enough where the woman was standing there to come across her face. They say sturgeon couldn't make it over the falls. They're powerful swimmers. They're powerful jumpers. Sure, they could make it over the falls. They could have made it over the falls in the flood of 36, and they could have made it in the deglaciation in the bed, the river, when the systems were coming down like the veins in my hand across out from the north, working their way down to Long Island Sound. The sturgeon could have come up in any of those streams and set up shop. And those streams moved around as the river finally cut its course down to its Pangean fault line course that Bud was talking about. You know, the basalt bottom of the river where the continents came together and the volcanoes erupted and all the conditions that made this such an amazing piece of landscape out here, the land of the thunderbird, which is what the indigenous people saw when they saw the dinosaur footprints in the shale beds. This is the thunderbird. This is a place of thunder. The Great Falls is the place of thunder and the thunderbird. Anyway, the sturgeon are here. The young boys saw the young sturgeon fries. That was an inconvenient truth, probably worth millions and millions of dollars, perhaps over $1 billion over a 50-year license, to have to accommodate those poor sturgeon. I think that they should be accommodated. They're here. They're endangered. We have laws that are accounting for that. They were very important to indigenous people. On the evening of May 19th, 1676, at the attack of the Great Falls, it was recorded by the English that the Indians just before the storm were out on the river fishing by torchlight. Now, if you read the books about what that was all about, they would get the sap and the pitch from the trees in order to create these torches, and they'd use the torches to fish for one specific fish, sturgeon. And so they were on the river fishing for sturgeon in 1676, and that was above the falls. So they've been here forever. And that's just been an inconvenient truth, and it's a beat, but when you know the truth, it's hard to unknow it, and I think we need to be accountable for those sturgeon. Thank you.
Thank you. We could go on for another couple of hours. We've already gone 30 minutes beyond our allotted time, so I'm going to have to end this session. If you want to send feedback to me, maybe we can schedule something else in the future. But clearly, people have a lot of thoughts and want to know a whole lot more about the watershed, and we're so fortunate. I want to thank each and every panelist for the time that they put into teaching us. And to all of you for participating. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sue, for organizing.
Yeah,
Is
thank
it,
you.
is it possible for them to contact you with their email addresses to get copies of some of the documents I have?
You can reach me